Today's topic, the one change that will make the biggest difference in your writing no matter what you're working on. When I was in college, I took several classes about teaching English to speakers of other languages, one of which focused on teaching writing. And I'm not sure that I remember too much from that class, but one thing that the professor said has been preserved in my mind ever since. He said that the most significant change in a writer's development happens when they go from writing for themselves to writing for a reader. And maybe that sounds obvious, but I think it's something that a lot of writers overlook, and I've seen firsthand how a writer's work can change when they do make the shift to writing for a reader. Plus, in the years since I took that class, I've actually learned where this idea came from, so we're going to dip our toes into some composition scholarship and probably have a whole heap of fun along the way. In 1979, the compositionist Linda Flower wrote a piece called Writer-Based Prose, a cognitive basis for problems in writing, in which, like the title says, she proposed the idea of writer-based prose, which she describes like this. As both a style of writing and a style of thought, writer-based prose is natural and adequate for a writer writing to himself or herself. However, it is the source of some of the most common and pervasive problems in academic and professional writing. The symptoms can range from a mere missing referent or an underdeveloped idea to an unfocused and apparently pointless discussion. The symptoms are diverse, but the source can often be traced to the writer's underlying strategy for composing and to his or her failure to transform private thought into a public, reader-based expression. That is to say that writer-based prose exists to serve the writer's cognitive purposes. Its first priority is to make sense to the writer, and that happens because the writer is using writing as a tool to figure out their own thoughts. I might call this writing as expression. It's about getting things out onto the page for the sake of getting them out. And that means that writer-based prose isn't written to make sense to a reader, it's meant to help the writer make sense of their own thoughts and feelings. As a result, and as Flower points out, this kind of writing creates problems for readers, and many of these problems are things we've talked about on the show before. So writer-based prose can be marked by small hiccups, like ambiguous pronouns. You might know what you mean when you use words like this or it, but there's no guarantee that your reader will. Those words can refer to just about anything that comes before them, so it's almost impossible for a reader to know for certain what you're referring to unless you tell them. And it can get more serious too, like when a research paper is full of information that does support your thesis, but your reader can't see how because, again, you haven't bothered to tell them. Just because it makes sense to you doesn't mean that it will automatically make sense to a reader. But writer-based prose can also show up in all kinds of scenarios beyond these two instances. It shows up in angsty poems that overflow with abstract darkness or melancholy that's not attached to anything particular, or at least not to anything that shows up on the page. It shows up in fiction that tells you everything you could even imagine wanting to know about the land, its politics, its history, and everybody's unique magical powers before anything even happens to get the story going. It shows up in persuasive arguments that detail a writer's opinion on a topic without really trying to motivate anyone to do anything about it. And it shows up in YouTube comments that are more about expressing how smart you think you are than actually communicating with your fellow viewers or the creator. Of course, it also shows up in more benign and even useful ways. Writer-based prose is at work when you write in a journal to process your thoughts, when you take notes and create an outline for a research paper, or when you write an angry and vengeful email that you never intend to actually send. In any case, writer-based prose is about expression. It's about getting your thoughts out of your head and onto the page. The goal is not to help somebody else to understand. The goal is to help yourself understand your thoughts and then work with them. And for the most part, if not universally, this is where everyone's writing journey begins. It's an acquired skill to get your thoughts out of your head and onto paper. Before you can even think about readers or an audience, you need to learn how to collect your thoughts and feelings, put them into words, and then arrange those words into sentences. In fact, this might be where every writing project starts. Novelists write drafts and character sketches. Scholars take notes and produce outlines, and poets turn words and images over and over until things settle into place. Starting with writer-based prose is not the issue. The problem arises when you get stuck there. That's because you're not really accomplishing much if your writing only makes sense to you. Sure, sometimes you just need to get things out of your head so you can deal with them. But if your goal is to have readers and then communicate something to them, you're going to have to adopt a different set of writing strategies. So the real breakthrough in someone's development as a writer comes when they make the shift to producing reader-based prose, which Flower describes like this. Reader-based prose is a deliberate attempt to communicate something to a reader. To do that, it creates a shared language and shared context between writer and reader. Reader-based prose reflects the purpose of the writer's thought. Writer-based prose tends to reflect its process. So where writer-based prose is really about expression, reader-based prose is about communication. Writer-based prose succeeds when what was in your head gets out of your head. Reader-based prose succeeds when what was in your head gets into somebody else's. And Flower's point about reader-based prose is an important one that really highlights what changes when a writer learns to write for their readers instead of for themselves. For example, if you're writing an academic argument, the purpose is not to just summarize all of your sources and then tell your reader, here's why I believe what I believe, and yet I see many newer writers doing exactly that. These kinds of papers are, more or less, just a live replay of the writer's thoughts as they wrote. In other words, these kinds of papers mostly just show us the writer's process. We get to read about their sources in the order that they found them, and they spend 5 or 6 pages talking about the issue before landing on a thesis somewhere probably on the last page, if not in the last paragraph. This is the classic upside-down paper that we've talked about before, and all it does is show us the writer's thought process as they tried to figure out their argument. Remember, the purpose of an argument is not just to state a thesis, it's to get your audience to believe what you believe and then do something about it. Simply giving them a document where you ramble about your sources for a while and then finally land on a thesis isn't going to do that job. The only thing it can do is help you to figure out the argument that you want to make. So instead, figure out what you're going to say first and then figure out how you're going to get your readers on board. Those are two very different papers, but the reader-based version will actually accomplish its persuasive purpose. In fact, I think that this is what revision really comes down to, taking your thoughts as you are figuring things out and then transforming them into a version that will actually have the intended effect on the reader. At its heart, revision is a move from more writer-based writing to more reader-based writing. And we see the same thing happen in creative writing too. If you spend any amount of time listening to creative writers tell stories about their lives, you'll inevitably hear one of them tell the story of spending weeks or months writing a story or novel and then taking their magnum opus to a teacher or advisor, only to have that teacher tell them to cut the first half. That's a sign that that first draft was writer-based prose. It was all stuff that the writer needed to figure out in order to tell their story, but it was more than a reader actually needed in order to understand the story. The purpose of a novel isn't to detail the entire historical record of an imaginary civilization. It's to tell a good story. And I think I've mentioned before that when I write poetry, my final versions are usually about half as long as the initial drafts. And that's because writing is a useful tool for figuring out what I want to say. But readers don't need to see me reenact every step of that discovery, so I can give them a more efficient and purposeful revised package in the end. So it's one thing, of course, to talk about the need to move to more reader-based writing, but it's another thing entirely to do it. Luckily, doing it is pretty straightforward. All you need to do is practice, and that might not be the most glamorous answer, but it is the truth. And there are various ways to practice seeing your work through a reader's eyes instead of just creating and recreating writer-based prose. Of course, the most direct way to get a reader's perspective on your work is to find an actual person and ask them to read your work and then tell you what they think. That can be tricky though, because if you end up with a reader who will only say, "Wow, good job, that was an amazing story and I can't think of any suggestions," is as good as no reader at all. But if you can find a good reader who will show you how they read your work, that will go a long way towards helping you to cultivate a reader's perspective. I can think of a handful of classmates and teachers who have been thoughtful and careful readers of my work in the past, and I still hear their voices in my head sometimes while I'm writing. Because they were willing to show me what they thought as they were reading, I've been able to internalize a better sense of what my readers are looking for. You can also practice being a thoughtful reader yourself. I've learned a ton about writing by giving people feedback on their writing, maybe even more than I've learned through the direct study of writing itself. Even if you don't have other writers in your life that you can work with, you can still think carefully about the things that you read or watch or listen to, and then reflect on what that tells you about what readers value. If there's a book you really like, spend some time thinking about why you like it, and then make plans to implement those insights into your own work. In other words, think about what you value as a reader and then emulate it as a writer. It might also be useful to spend some time with reviews or critiques of various media. I've said before that I don't think of myself as much of a fiction writer, but I have learned a thing or two about what the audience of fiction values by listening to the odd review of a movie or game. When you listen to critics talk about what makes a story good or bad, you can begin to recognize what your readers actually want and what they probably don't need. And of course, when all else fails, you can do one of my favorite things and just leave your writing alone for a while. Write your draft and set it aside. Go do other things and try to forget about it as much as possible. When you come back to a piece after a long separation, you can't help but see it more through the eyes of a reader than a writer. You're no longer stuck in the weeds of figuring out what you're trying to say, and you're not caught up in the same thought processes that you were when you wrote it. If you come back to a piece and can't figure out what you meant to say, then you can be sure that your readers will never stand a chance. So fix what past you wrote using the readerly eyes of present you, and you'll be able to produce a revision that will ultimately serve your readers and your purpose much more effectively. And of course, there's probably an infinity of other things that you could do, but these strategies will get you started, and they've all worked really well for me. I'll often hear people say that they write just for themselves, especially creative writers who think it's some profound artistic thing to create without an audience in mind. But at its heart, writing is a form of communication, so it's both antisocial and ineffective to write without readers in mind, while also hoping that your readers will fall in love with whatever you write. So it's worth taking some time to consider your readers and what they hope for and expect from the things that they read. If your goal is to communicate something, you'll want to make sure that your writing serves their needs and not just your own. And again, moving into reader-based prose is something that comes with practice and revision. You'll probably inevitably start out with writer-based prose, but you just need to remember not to stay there. Your priorities are important, but they're meaningless if a reader can't understand or appreciate them. So learn to see your work through a reader's eyes. Add what's missing, trim what's unnecessary, and organize what's left over in a clear and sensible way. Do that, and your writing will be immeasurably better than when you were just writing for yourself. It turns out that when your writing is designed to be read, it actually will be. So get to know your readers and learn to see the writing world through their eyes. In the meanwhile, I'll be looking forward to seeing you again in the next one.